So we have just seen sampling as a compromise between calibration and the choice of the relevant survey units. We have also looked at the nature and evolution of sampling. And this is the point where we must recall a golden rule, because it is at the level of sampling that it is the most strongly felt, even though it does apply to different areas of research or the study. So I'm going to be speaking to you of the three golden rules, which we show in terms of principles and practices. The principles are implemented during the work and therefore are put into practice. These three golden rules are summed up in three words: triangulation, iteration, and saturation. The principle of triangulation consists in crossing over information. We must have different sources of information, and we've seen this at different levels according to the methods. And once we're in the interview part, we need to have interviewees that are different. So we must compose a research strategy based on significant differences. The principle of iteration is similar to repetition. Iterate means to repeat, and this is what we find in experimental sciences. We need to have several repetitions to validate a result. So within a group, within a type of individuals who we believe to be similar, we must have several interviews, repeat the interviews several times, lead several interviews in order to confirm one type of information. Of course, once we've heard a thing one time, we cannot validate it as being final data. And it is thanks to the repetition, the fact that we hear the same data or information several times, this is what validates the information. So in social sciences, we never look for proof, but for plausibility. Therefore, iteration joined with the crossing over of information, with triangulation, will give rise to this plausibility and will make the data collected robust and will provide us with a rigorous corpus of data. This iteration, which I have just mentioned, the fact of repeating interviews with trainers or interviewees who are the same, we will call concrete iteration, whereas the iteration that we find in the to and fro between the problematic and the data, interpretation and results, will be called abstract iteration, and therefore both are complementary and necessary. Finally, the third golden rule for sampling and leading the research through interviews and surveys is saturation. I haven't yet spoken about this because to date we have been speaking about implementation. Saturation comes in during the project. As its name indicates, we reach a level of saturation. Saturation of what? Saturation with regard to the information that we are obtaining. At one point, we are no longer learning a lot, or there is a lot of repetition, but without giving us any new information. So, once we have got over the stage of necessary iteration to validate the information collected and to measure its importance, we must manage to feel this point of saturation. So it's both a signal to bring the phase to an end, otherwise it will be to the detriment of other phases of your study. You cannot eternally extend surveys because, as we've seen, our means are always restricted. And we saw this on the reflection on calibration. And it's also a methodological guarantee of prime importance. As long as we're learning new things, we can say that we might be missing some important information. Therefore, we have to feel this point of saturation. And we mustn't leave the field too early on because we might miss something important. So this means that we must take into account the exceptions, specific cases, with the same attention as what we call the modal case, meaning the most usual cases. Because sometimes it's on the margins that we discover things that will provide a lot of meaning with regard to the situation that we're studying. So even in an exploratory research phase, some statistics are necessary. We cannot work on a sample that is below 30 interviews, 30 people met, in order to have a minimum amount of triangulation, iteration, and we are not sure that we will reach saturation. And these 30 people also correspond to a figure that is often found in statistic samples, standard statistic samples in different disciplines. We can also give a few references on some samples, because when we achieve 20% of interviewees within a population, we should manage to have combined these different principles: triangulation, iteration, saturation. If the sample is larger, we will see that at 15% of interviewees with regard to the population, we have applied these three principles. So on the size of the sample, from a few hundred individuals or units, relevant research units, or several thousands or millions, there is a gap, of course. And you know that in very large populations, a sample of 2,000 interviews is considered to be satisfactory according to statistic laws that you have seen and will see in other lessons. So this small statistic rule to guide you, but the main thing is really to be able to control triangulation, iteration, and saturation.